All right. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start running through the citywide text amendments as proposed by council. Petra, can you give me a nod to confirm that you can see both the spreadsheet and the IDO on my screen?
I can, yes.
Great. As Petra mentioned, we will only be covering the white lines in the spreadsheet, the distinction between the white and the gray being amendments that were proposed by city councilors and amendments that were proposed by the administration and the planning department. So starting on page 1 here, I'm going to pop to page 1 in the IDO, so you'll be able to see the page in the IDO that is proposed to be changed to give you some context about what section of the document we're in. So this is the purpose section of the IDO. The proposal is to add a new purpose statement related to protecting natural resources, including major public open space, sensitive lands, the Rio Grande, and waterways that lead to our river. The intention being that the purpose statement, the purpose section of the IDO really lays the groundwork for the regulations that follow and what those regulations are determined to do, what they're trying to protect or enhance, etc. And there isn't an explicit purpose statement about these particular topics. So that is the purpose for this amendment. Moving down to the next line in the spreadsheet, this takes us to the use table of the IDO. This is the use table that tells you what you can and cannot do in a particular zone district. This change here for the use table proposes to make drive-throughs and drive-ups an accessory use in the MXL zone. Currently, drive-ups and drive-throughs are a conditional use, but in response to COVID-19 and the pandemic, we have seen the need for drive-throughs and drives-up as a way for people to safely get goods and services. Making drive-throughs and drive-ups accessory in the MXL zone will make them more accessible citywide. Okay, moving down now to the cottage development use. There are a couple of amendments proposed related to cottage development. I will talk about each of them individually here. The first one proposes to revise the text to say that the minimum project size for cottage development is 10,000 square feet citywide. So that would propose to change this 2-acre minimum that you see in the IDO today to 10,000 square feet, allowing for more flexibility if a property owner wanted to pursue cottage development. Another proposal related to cottage development says that the use shall require a conditional use approval pursuant to the conditional use process if it's located outside of a UCMS or PT area, that's urban center, main street, or premium transit area. Those are some of our more urban centers and corridors. That is at least 10,000 square feet, but no larger than 1 acre. So the idea here is if you would like to do cottage development outside of a center or corridor on a smaller lot, that could be an option for you if this amendment passes, but you would have to go through the conditional use process instead of it being allowed by right, which is what the previous amendment contemplated. And then lastly, related to cottage development, this would add some centers and corridors in which the smaller lot size could be appropriate. So if you look in the IDO over here, there's a list here of some centers and corridors where you can have a smaller lot and do cottage development. This proposal proposes to add activity centers, that's AC, downtown, that's DT, and employment centers to that list of areas where you could do cottage development on a smaller lot. Okay, moving down to community residential facilities. All right, this proposes to delete subsection C and D under the community residential facility use. These use-specific standards, that I've highlighted here are distance separation requirements for what we call CRFs. Community residential facilities. CRFs are, transitional type housing for folks that are considered a protected class under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And what the Federal Fair Housing Act tells the city and all municipalities across the country is you have to treat those protected classes just like you would treat anyone else. And what that means is we cannot have additional or specific limitations on where those folks can find housing. And so the proposal is to remove the 1,500-foot distance separation requirement that exists today, and also the 30 limit cap for each city council district. I want to preface this change with there is a kind of sister use to CRFs called group homes, which are meant to house folks that are not protected by the Federal Fair Housing Act. And there are not any changes considered for those distance separation requirements. The city can and will continue to have those distance separation requirements for those types of homes. This is really an effort to make sure that our zoning regulations are in compliance with the Federal Fair Housing Act, with the speculation right now that there could be a conflict. Kind of a sister change to that is in the group home use that you see down here, there's a reference to community residential facilities. Because we're removing the distance separations for CRFs up here, we want to make sure that group homes and their distance separations exist on their own and only interface with other group homes. So the references to CRFs will come out of these two sections that I'm hovering over here. Okay, moving down to page, 164. We are now talking about light vehicle fueling stations, or as non-zoning folk might call them, gas stations. The proposal here is to remove the standard, alter the standard that talks about the maximum setback for a gas station. So what the IDO says today is that in these more urbanized areas, those are our centers, our corridors, and the MXH zone, there's a limitation in the IDO today that your building cannot be any more than 15 foot away from the front property line. For a lot of uses in the IDO, that might make sense as we think of an urban context, but for a gas station, where the use is a little unique in that a lot of the activity happens in front of the building, that's the pumps where you pump your gas, those really do need to be a little closer to the street and allowed to happen within that front setback area. What this looks like today is in those areas, if you were to develop a gas station, you would have to put your gas pumps behind your building. And there are safety concerns associated with that. If you've ever pumped gas, which I'm sure you have, it's preferable that you're closer to the street where, oncoming traffic can see what you're doing and see what other people are doing, and other people pumping gas can have a good view of the street. It makes for a safer environment for the person who has to be out of their car pumping gas. So this will allow those pumps to be between the street and the building, as opposed to being behind the building in those urban areas. All right, moving down to light vehicle sales and rental, commonly known as things like car dealerships or car rental agencies. There's a regulation in the IDO today that says in the MXH zone district, outdoor display or storage of vehicles is prohibited. What this proposes to do is to extend that prohibition. Petra, is that correct, to the UCMSPT areas?
It would limit it to, so right now the prohibition applies to everyone in the MXH. And what this would do is say the prohibition only applies if you're an MXH and a UCMSPT area. So if you're in an MXH zone and maybe at the far end of, let's say, Lomas, you're not a main street, you're not premium transit, you're not in an urban center, you would be allowed to do outdoor display of your vehicles, but you couldn't if you were in those more urban areas.
That's right. Thank you. I got myself a little twisted thinking that this word "in" read as "and," which is an example of how zoning regulations can get finicky in their verbiage. Yes, Petra explained that perfectly, and I will not try to screw it up, and I will move on. Okay, moving down to page 221, this is the site design and sensitive lands section of the IDO. This change and the next couple of changes came at the request of the city's Open Space Advisory Board. This is an appointed board of public members who make recommendations to the city on not only things like open space acquisition, which parcels of open space the city should prioritize for purchase, but also they are tasked with advising the council and the mayor and the EPC on regulations such as these that can help protect that investment of major public open space for the city as far as private development is concerned. The Open Space Advisory Board has taken a good look at the Integrated Development Ordinance. They've looked at how the IDO has interacted with recent private development that's occurred near major public open space, and they have devised some recommendations to further protect major public open space moving into the future. So that's the background for where these couple of changes came from. The first is to add riparian areas to the list of sensitive lands. So if you look in the sensitive lands section here, where my cursor is moving, there's a list of areas that the city considers particularly special and in need of additional protection and consideration. Riparian areas are proposed to be added to that list. I'll talk later about what we mean by a riparian area. There's a definition that is proposed to be added that will come up later in the spreadsheet. And the purpose of adding riparian areas to this list is a private developer would have to do additional analysis on their site. If they are determined to be adjacent to a riparian area, the goal is to make sure that that riparian area they're near continues to be preserved and protected as best possible. And so this will go on the list for the avoidance of sensitive land section, which calls for a heightened analysis.
And Shauna, I'll just add in there that it would also apply if the riparian area were on their property. So the avoidance of sensitive lands is about what you have on your site. And then also if you're adjacent to certain sensitive lands, there's some sections later that will talk about what you need to do when you're adjacent to that. So there's this section about riparian areas is going to have several overlaps as we go through the spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's a great clarification, Petra. Thanks. So this next white line in the spreadsheet that talks about adding a new subsection to the avoidance of sensitive land section, that's still the section we're looking at, that says landscaping on lots abutting arroyos shall be per section 5.6C4. This proposal proposes to add additional requirements if you're going to be landscaping right next to an arroyo, that there are particular plant species that are appropriate to plant there, with the concern from the Open Space Advisory Board being that if you plant any old thing next to an arroyo, with the concern being particularly about invasive species that we have seen crop up in Albuquerque, that there is a tendency for the seeds from those plants to go into the arroyo and then flow down to the river. And once those seeds make it down to the river and to the bosque, then they take root. And there is a lot of cleanup work and maintenance that the Open Space Division has to do to get those invasive species out. So if we can kind of curtail what's being flown down an arroyo into the river by regulating the plant species that can be planted there, it'll be a big help to the health of our bosque and to the Open Space Division, which spends a lot of staff time, volunteer time, and money to remediate those problems. All right, moving down to page 229. This proposal asks for an additional buffer if you are developing adjacent to anything on this list, which is steep slopes, escarpments, wetlands, or riparian areas that are located in designated major public open space. Steep slopes, escarpments, wetlands, and riparian areas are all defined terms, so a property owner should be able to be aware of when they are developing near those. with a new requirement that you will have to provide a 50-foot buffer between any development on the private property and that special area. Currently, the IDO calls for either a single loaded street or a landscape buffer as determined by the open space superintendent. This requirement would be on top of that existing requirement. So if this amendment passes, what you would end up with is either the single loaded street or the landscape buffer and an additional 50-foot buffer next to those areas. The IDO today, for example, says that that landscape buffer that the open space superintendent can require has to be 45 feet. So this 50-foot buffer on top of that would look like a 95-foot buffer between development and these special sensitive spaces. That concludes the changes to the sensitive land section. So let's move out to parking requirements. So this is the parking table in the IDO that tells a property owner how much off-street parking they have to provide for their development. The proposal here is to revise the amount of parking required if you're providing an outdoor dining area from 5 spaces to 3 spaces for every 1,000 square feet of outdoor dining space. So this is a reduction in required parking only for outdoor dining areas, with the idea that the city should really be incentivizing outdoor dining. Given the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions we've seen on indoor dining, the more outdoor dining we can entice property owners to build at their restaurants and bars and the like, the better. So this should help, with the trade-off being you will get to provide a little bit less parking, but you'll have more outdoor dining space, which has been so important during these times where we've seen the closures and reductions. All right, moving on to talk more about drive-throughs, which we did talk about a little bit earlier. This table talks about the required stacking spaces a drive-through or drive-up has to provide. That's the lane that you sit in your car to get to the order board, to order your drink or your sandwich, or to speak to the bank teller, or to receive your retail good. It's the whole area that encompasses where you make that order and also where you receive that order. The city has minimum standards on how many cars that line has to hold. And the intent in regulating that at all is to make sure that the parking lot is not inundated with a huge line of cars, which could be a danger to folks trying to get in and out of their cars to enter an establishment, and to make sure that those stacking lanes do not end up in the roadway. That's even more dangerous if you have a drive-through waiting line kind of backed up into a public roadway where cars are trying to travel. So the intent behind this change is to increase the number of cars that can be stacked in one of those lanes. And this is again in response to what we've seen during COVID-19 and the pandemic, with the kind of explosion of the need for drive-up facilities, that they need to be able to hold more cars because more people are going to continue to use drive-throughs. That's the thinking. Okay, moving on to landscaping. This amendment proposes to add a new sentence that says landscaping shall be maintained per the requirements of section 513B6. This is a cross-reference to another section that talks about your landscaping plan. And the intent behind this one being, once you have a landscaping plan approved for a property, that landscaping plan must be honored for the life of that property or for the life of that landscaping plan until it is further amended. When a property changes hands between one owner and another, the regulations that were approved under that first property owner do not simply go away. That site plan and that landscaping plan continue owner to owner. And this change proposes to make that clear. more clear than it already is in the IDO today, to make sure property owners know that if they acquire a property that has existing approvals on it, they have to honor and follow those existing approvals. All right, we are still in the landscaping section. This relates to a new regulation we talked about a little bit in the open, in the sensitive land section of the IDO, about landscaping abutting arroyos. So the earlier regulation we talked about said that if you're landscaping abutting to arroyo, go look at section 56C4. Well, here is what section 56C4 proposes to say. It simply makes a cross-reference to the approved landscaping palette, the Albuquerque plant palette, which is a plant palette that's devised between the city of Albuquerque and the planning department and the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority. It's a list of plants that are appropriate for our climate and our environment. All right, moving down to sign regulations. This is a change related to joint premises signs. So that's going to be this section here that I've highlighted. The IDO, when it was adopted, had kind of a funky way of thinking about joint premises signs, particular to when you have a premise that has a lot of large lots on it. The idea for shopping malls or strip center type development is the ideal scenario is that you have one big podium sign where you might list all of your little shops on one sign to reduce sign clutter, which is something the city tries to make sure that we have a good balance of, that businesses have adequate signage so people can find them, but also so drivers and pedestrians and people traveling down a roadway don't have to, look at billboard after billboard after billboard. So this particular change proposes to remove these two regulations, which in practice put shopping center owners who had large parcels in kind of a funky situation where, and I get this backwards sometimes, so Petra, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have large lots that have more than 100 foot of street frontage, you were not allowed to do a joint premise sign with your neighboring parcels. And like I said, we do want to encourage people to do joint premises signs because it helps with sign clutter. So this proposal quite simply proposes to delete these two sections to make sure that those large platted lots can continue or can start to have joint premises signs with their neighbors. Okay, moving down to the review and approval process. So this section is the review and decision criteria for the Development Review Board, which is one of our review and approval agencies for kind of mid-tier projects and site plans. There is a new review and decision criteria proposed to be added here that will say the site plan mitigates any significant adverse impact on adjacent residential developments. I'll go ahead and let you read the rest while I explain it. With the idea being that this is a what's the word I'm looking for? Not subjective, discretionary. This is a discretionary review criteria, and under the last IDO annual update, we removed discretion from the Development Review Board. The thinking was that board in particular, in how they operate as a panel of technical experts, could not act discretionarily. And what that requires is for them to operate in a quasi-judicial manner. That being that they have elevated meeting procedures that have to do with swearing people in, making sure the public and folks have an opportunity to provide public comment, to cross-examine folks participating in the hearing, and most importantly, that the folks making the decisions, those DRB members, not have ex parte communication. Previous thinking was the DRB just simply could not accommodate that setup, but the DRB chair and the staff over at Planning have been working really hard on this to make sure that they actually can do that. And so they feel confident that they can operate as a quasi-judicial board, which means they can have some of this discretionary review back in their book. So the way that we've devised this discretionary review is it's specific to particular development, development that's adjacent to existing residential development, and the discretion will be limited to these areas: wall height, access and driveway placement, landscape spacing, plant density, or alternative plantings. That those are the things that that board should be able to have some wiggle room on, to help a development be a good neighbor for what it's developing next to. All right, moving into the definitions section of the IDO, we are talking about cluster development, which is this top one up here. This proposal will add to the definition that the purpose of cluster development is not to necessarily increase the density of that development. The true purpose of cluster development is that you are grouping your dwellings on your lot to preserve some kind of existing open space on your property. There have been some questions and comments and perhaps complaints that cluster development has just been a way for developers to get more density on a particular parcel or project, and that was never the intention of cluster development. And this is just some clarifying language to make sure that that is clear. Okay, staying in the definitions section of the IDO, we are now moving to the common open space definition. That's this top definition here. So this proposal proposes to add this underlined language that when we're thinking about common open space and what we're telling you can be counted as common open space, which, as a reminder, only relates to cluster development. Common open space does not appear as a requirement anywhere else outside of cluster development, in which cluster development says that 30% of your project has to be dedicated to this thing, common open space. And so we're further refining what we mean by common open space so a developer is clear about what it is they are to preserve on their site. So we are adding existing site features, making clear that the purpose of common open space is also for the preservation of site features, and that historic buildings or structures, sensitive lands, and hazard-prone areas all count on that list, in addition to making it clear that on-site ponding will not count. There has been concern over on-site ponding counting towards common open space under today's regulations, in the sense that sometimes that on-site ponding is not necessarily owned by the owner of that property. And that creates some real uncertainty moving into the future about if a property owner were to count that on-site ponding for their 30% requirement, and the true owner of that ponding, which is often the city of Albuquerque or a MAFGA, chooses to, cover over or otherwise disassemble that on-site ponding, you no longer meet your 30% requirement. So it doesn't make sense to allow that to count towards the 30%, so we are proposing to remove it. Still in the definitions section of the IDO, we are now talking about the definition of a public hearing. The proposal here is to amend the definition of public hearing to take out based on policy in addition to regulations. As we think about the review and decision bodies in the city of Albuquerque who conduct public hearings, not all of them are necessarily policy-based. And having this reference to policy in the public hearing definition could lead someone to believe that anytime something is labeled as a public hearing, that there's a policy consideration with that hearing, and that's truly just not the case. So we are tidying up this definition to make it more accurate and true to what we really mean. All right, I will take you to a page in the IDO about sensitive lands. So here is where all of our sensitive lands are actually defined. We talked about these sensitive lands earlier: arroyos, escarpments, floodplains, etc. This is where the new riparian area definition will live. This definition was devised by open space staff at the city, and will fit into this section so that a property owner can come to this definition, see what the city means when they say riparian area, and know if they have one on their property or are adjacent to one. The open space division at the city of Albuquerque is also working on a map of where all the riparian areas in the city are, so that that visual tool can help property owners determine if they have to be considerate or aware of any riparian areas on or near their property. All right, these last three, you'll see that they say multiple on the page. That means there will not be one page for me to point you to in the IDO. These are larger concepts that have implications in multiple sections of the document. So the first one is a food truck court. Currently, the IDO has a mobile food truck as a singular use, saying if you have one food truck, you can park it and operate it in certain areas. There are certain requirements you have to follow, but the document does not currently consider if you would like to have 2 food trucks or 3 food trucks or 6 food trucks operate as a pod type thing. This is becoming kind of a trendy way to do restaurant development, having mobile food trucks that can travel around the city and park in various areas. And to be responsive to that new use that we're seeing happen around the country, we also want to have a way to make that happen. So this proposes to add that as a use with some rules that are very similar to the food truck use today, about things like you have to provide trash cans so that your patrons have somewhere to throw their trash, and any seating that you may provide cannot obstruct the sidewalk, etc. There will also be parking required for this use, on-site parking, so that if people want to come enjoy your food truck pod or food truck court, as we're calling them here, those folks have to have somewhere off-street to park. And I think, Petra, are you aware of any other specific requirements that we should mention? They're not all listed here specifically.
I don't think so, but the exhibit kind of lists out everything for this, or the memo, sorry, lists out everything associated with this. So it's adding it to the use table, adding some use specific standards, and then adding some requirements in the parking section.
Yep, great. The next kind of larger concept that has implications throughout the IDO is amending the campgrounds and RV use. Today, campgrounds and RV only exist in the NRSU zone, that's non-residential sensitive use zone. The proposal here is to move that from the NRSU zone district into the MXL and MXM zones. This makes campgrounds and RV areas more available to do citywide, with some pretty elaborate use-specific standards about providing buffering and access when you are developing adjacent to things like residential areas. The purpose of this amendment is kind of a common theme you've seen through some of these amendments, is in response to COVID-19 and the pandemic. There have been a lot of folks who have been seeking a way to vacation in a way that's safer than going and staying in a hotel, kind of a closed environment, or in an Airbnb, which is kind of most often a personal domicile of sorts. Campgrounds and RV are a great way for people to get outside of their own homes, where we're all kind of stuck at right now, and enjoy some fresh weather. In addition, Albuquerque's climate is so great for this use. We can camp and enjoy RV usage for most of the year, I would say. And so to allow the city to do this use in more places has economic benefits, in addition to being responsive to what we're seeing happen in the world today. Okay, the last one that I'm going to talk about is about the public meeting definition. So we talked about the public hearing definition just a moment ago. This is kind of a sister amendment in that there's a distinction in the IDO between a public hearing and a public meeting. And really the distinction the IDO makes is that one has to be conducted under quasi-judicial procedures, which I mentioned before about swearing people in, allowing cross-examination, not having ex parte communication, and the other one doesn't. Well, this public meeting definition really only applied to the Development Review Board, and due to the other changes that we're making to the Development Review Board that will make them a permanent quasi-judicial body and board with discretion, there's simply no need for the definition of a public meeting. They will always operate as public hearings, and so this just becomes kind of extra words in the document that we don't need. So this proposes to strike the definition in the definition chapter here and throughout the IDO where that phrase appears, because public hearings are what we will actually mean in all those instances. That concludes the review for the citywide text amendments.